We're going to shift gears now and talk a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We look forward to a fruitful conversation with our esteemed panel here, but first, to kick us off, an inspirational message from Renée Sattiewhite, President and CEO of the African American Credit Union Coalition.
Greetings. I'm Renée Sattiewhite, President and CEO of the African American Credit Union Coalition, the AACUC. I wanted to be there in person, but we are right in the middle of our annual strategic planning session, and I can't miss it. I am encouraged that all of you are attending either in person or through video channels. I'm the possibility of people serving other people passionately. Let me say that again. I'm the possibility of people serving other people passionately, which makes this video greeting all the more special. Clearly, we all agree that sustainability is a part of inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and belonging. It is wonderful that you've gathered together to discuss, listen, and learn strategies and tactics that can be taken back to our various communities for implementation, a way for all of us to help change in sustainability. I'd like to thank John Lewis, President and CEO, for allowing his team to put this summit on. I am proud of the work that UNFCU is doing and pleased that we are partners. Have a great conference and learn some stuff from me.
Thank you so much, Renée. Now, to introduce our next speakers in this great panel on DEI, please welcome Pamela Agnon, Executive Vice President at UNFCU and the co-executive sponsor of UNFCU's Global Sustainability Program. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm very excited to introduce our next panel of experts. And as we all know, credit unions play a crucial role in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion within the financial sector. This topic has garnered considerable attention, most recently at the National Credit Union Administration's annual conference. We'd like to continue the conversation here today with NCUA's Miguel Polanco, Director of the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, together with other leading experts from within and outside our industry. Providing their insights are Ashley Riker, Vice President, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Hudson Valley Credit Union from New York, Ayris T. Scales, Senior Vice President, Social Responsibility and Global Initiatives with the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts based here in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to share a little bit at UNFCU, you should know diversity is the key to our success. We've created an organizational culture that embraces allyship, differences, transparency, and equitable growth opportunities for career development and leadership advancement. Last year, we were excited to expand our program to introduce belonging. And so belonging is how we make each other feel at the workplace. Business resource groups, which many of you are already organized, these provide an excellent way for employees to share unique perspectives, engage in important and often difficult conversations, and celebrate the differences that make us stronger. Recognizing the diversity among credit unions, today, we want to explore emerging trends in DEI. And our question is DEI a fad or is it here to stay? Facilitating the discussion will be moderator Dr. Samira Salem, Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Credit Union National Association. Welcome, Samira, and thank you for monitoring and joining us all the way from the West Coast. Samira has extensive experience in international economic development, community development, economic policy research, and DEI. Before joining CUNA in 2018 as a senior policy analyst in its economics department, she worked for Forward Community Investments, a CDFI focused on advancing racial equity in the state of Wisconsin. Earlier, Samira worked in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. International Trade Commission as its senior trade analyst for labor, and at DAI as an international economic development specialist. Samira has earned her PhD in political economy and public policy and her master's in economics from the University of Southern California. Samira, I'm going to turn it over to you to start and moderate our panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pamela. And it's wonderful to see everyone here. There's some familiar faces, some new faces, which I hope we have an opportunity to get to know over the course of this day. I also want to give a thank you to OAS Federal Credit Union, UNFCU for hosting this incredible opportunity to talk about sustainability. And I love that y'all have the Sustainable Development Goals on that back wall there. I was taking a look at those and just connecting the dots, which I think all of us here are very well familiar with. But when you think about sustainability from a holistic perspective, there are obviously those elements that emerge that, we think about it that are environmental related, climate related, but also those social elements. And so probably about a third of those, if you go back and take a look at that, are directly related to what we're going to be talking about today. And that's DEI, and yes, the B for belonging. So just thank you all for being here today, being a part of this conversation, and to my awesome fellow panelists here, just really grateful to have this conversation with you. So we heard a little bit about you, but I always think it's important to just get to know who we're talking to and who's saying the things we're hearing. And also, as part of that, what your why or what your motivation for the work that you're doing around DEIB. So I'd love to start with Ayris, if you could introduce yourself a little bit, and then share your why, and if you could also add your organization's why.
Absolutely. I was ready to go last so I can build off of what everybody else
There
said.
you are.
Well, good afternoon. So I'm Ayris Scales, and I am the Senior Vice President of Social Responsibility and Global Initiatives with NAREIT. We are the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts, very long. And at the end of the day, we are a trade association that wants to make sure that REITs are protected and advanced and expanded globally. And my charge is to increase the visibility and connectivity of vendors, communities, and just everyday people to the REIT industry. How many of you all know what a REIT is? Okay, yeah, because we're in here with financial folks, so you get it. When I had the opportunity to join this role, I was actually coming from a foundation that invested in women of color entrepreneurs, and prior to that had been in a few different politically appointed roles. But this was something that allowed me, one, to expand my knowledge and to expand my reach, but to really be at the table for an industry that, be very candid, is 90% white, male, legacy led, owned, and operated. And the fact that we have these publicly traded companies who are genuinely leaning in and committing to ways to figure out how they can help increase diversification, equity, and inclusion at all levels was something I wanted to make sure I was a part of. And so from a philanthropic standpoint, I get to help with where we're investing funding. From a talent pipeline standpoint, I get to bring resources and training to our members, as well as working with them around supplier diversity. And so I just think it's so critical as we think about how we continue to close this economic gap, really beyond racial and gender, but it's really getting down to those socioeconomics.
Thank you, Miguel.
Hello, my name is Miguel Polanco. I'm the Director of the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion at the National Credit Union Administration. That's a mouthful. Before I start, let me say that all of my comments and remarks are my own. They are not representative of the agency, the board, or anybody else. So let's get that out of the way. In terms of my why, I came about I call this my fourth or maybe fifth career, because I was in the military, I was in investment banking, I was doing real estate for a while, flipping houses before it became sexy, and eventually went into doing supply diversity, which is the first job that I had at the NCUA. But one of the things that happened in that journey is that you start learning about inequities, and you start learning about gaps, and you start learning about opportunities, and you start thinking about, what can we do to resolve these things? Yes, they've been around for a long time, but do I have ideas? Do I have something to contribute? So that over time moved me to become the deputy director, and then opportunity came to be the director. So ultimately the why for me is that impact. What are things that we can do? What game can I play in supply diversity, in workforce diversity, in improving diversity within the credit union system? That's my why. It's just, winning at the game of DEI. For the agency, it's, of course, if you look at any federal agency, typically the thinking is, well, they're compelled to do these things because The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission tells them to do it. The president tells them to do it, et cetera. But for the agency, it's not only about compliance, but I think about it as a journey from compliance to competence and eventually to culture. And if you think about it in terms of any organization, whether you like it or not, whether you're doing it or not, you're all impacted by culture. You create the culture by what you do, what you accept, what you don't accept. So how do we create a culture that is equitable, that is inclusive? Because ultimately, that is what brings you 100% of your employee. If you don't include them, if you don't respect them, if you don't value them, they'll recede and just give you that 60%. So the agency acknowledges that. And we want to move ourselves from right now, we believe that we're in the competence stage where we have programs and et cetera, but we want to move towards a place where actually culture is the driver for a lot of the results and outcomes that we have as an agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel.
Again, my name is Ashley Riker, and I'm the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Hudson Valley Credit Union in Hudson Valley, New York. Our operations office is in Poughkeepsie. So my personal why, in full transparency, being the parent of 4 young kids, one who is Gen Z and 3 Gen A, young people. The fabric of D&I, DEI work is something that they talk about every day. The things we're talking about in workspaces and in community spaces and among our peers, young people are expecting from us. It's not an initiative, it is an expectation. That this work is embedded in our workplaces, in our boardrooms, in our community spaces. So for me, seeing that work be driven by the young people in my life is my personal why. When it comes to Hudson Valley Credit Union and the organizational why behind this work, our people pillar is very clear. We are invested in diversity, equity, and inclusion work for our employees, our members, and the community. It's something that we value, and it's something that we want to build structure around. Things like our ERGs or doing that connective work is important, but looking at the structural inequities that we can impact is even more important. It's not about how we treat each other, it's having a structure that allows for equity and inclusion at all levels. Right? We love the interpersonal part, right? That's the part that's connective and great, but we want to make sure that the structures within our organization allow for equity and inclusion, no matter how we interact with each other every day. So I've done this work to kind of give a little background. I worked for an equality organization in New Jersey for a number of years. I came out of the healthcare space. I worked in health equity at a large hospital system in New Jersey. And walking into being a new person in the credit union space, in the financial space, I have become even more motivated to look at the wealth gap, look at structural inequity, look at how credit unions can do this work. And it's truly inspiring, kind of as a new member of the credit union community. So that's a little bit about my why. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say that I love public health. I love how holistic it is. I love the frameworks and how it sees everything as interconnected. So when we look at health outcomes, you have to look upstream in terms of what factors are driving poor health outcomes for marginalized communities, et cetera, and we in financial services play a role there. We're implicated there. So that space and the models that folks in public health have, I think, are tremendous and incredibly powerful, and I think are instructive to folks like ourselves. And I'd want to maybe start with you on this question, because you already started to get into it. This idea of the trends that we're seeing when it comes to DEI in the movement beyond Ayris, the movement, I mean, credit union movement. And what do you think is driving those trends? I feel like you already kind of gave us a clue on your perspective here, but let's just go ahead and double down on that.
Yeah, so, from my lens, this question and kind of the name of our panel, right, is this work a fad or here to stay? And I believe that if we really think about DEI work, words are important. And every time I have this conversation, I try to think about how our words impact how we see this work. So diversity is people. Equity is intentional fairness, right? And inclusion is experiencing belonging, right? So if we put that together, right? If we value people and we are intentional about being equitable, we will drive belonging, always. And I think sometimes the language that we use is what causes that dissonance around DEI work, right? Using that phrase DEI, some folks are not invested and some folks are super invested. But I think when we focus this on the fact that we are impacting the lives of people, whether it's our employees, our members of the community, this kind of trend or this expectation that DEI is it's an entity, it's a thing. No, it's embedded in what we do every day, right? We're here as people. We're talking about sustainability. We're talking about the lived experiences of our communities, having access to, we talked about health equity, access to safe housing, access to food security, access to supportive and safe communities, access to financial freedom and wellness. These are based on people. So DEI, in my lens, is here to stay.
Thank you. Miguel.
Yes, to your question, Samira, in terms of some of the trends or what I've seen, one of the things that happened for NCUA is that because of what happened in the financial crisis in 07 or 08, Dodd-Frank came about. And Section 342 of Dodd-Frank is the actually section of the law that created our Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, not only in NCUA, but FDIC and OCC and many other financial regulatory agencies. And the reason for that is because during the crisis, people of color and people that are more marginalized were at the most effect of the impact of the financial crisis. They were impacted disparately over any other type of group. And Congress wanted to make sure, or at least some people in Congress wanted to make sure that financial regulators were not only aware of that issue, but that created environments within each one of the federal regulatory agencies to make sure that that didn't happen. So our agency, and as well as many others, started the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion in 2011. So that started the conversation in part within the financial regulatory system, especially and particularly within NCUA and with the credit union industry. But then moving past that, of course, we have the murder of George Floyd, and that really took everything, up to another level of conscientiousness around this. I think the trend since Dodd-Frank has been, even though the mission of the credit union industry have been people helping people and really looking at advancing financial inclusion, is having a bigger conversation and a deeper conversation, a broader conversation about how credit unions can play a bigger role and a very critical role in making sure that there's financial inclusion, financial fairness, and financial wellness, to the people that we serve. And that's something that us as an agency are looking at promoting as well. So that to us is very important. So I guess, financial inclusion, even though it's been your mission all along, it has been something that, we as an agency are endorsing, promoting. And as you know, we have a DI Summit. We did the fourth one a month ago. Many of you that are here, were there. But you know that the focus that we have is essentially not only financial inclusion, but then also within your own organizations, how can you move people, move their attitudes, move their thinking, their behaviors, so that they can be fair and equitable to everybody and all the members that they serve.
Thank you.
I was going to add, even though I'm not directly in the credit union industry, some of the things that, if I'm just being very candid, that we're seeing And I think this goes back to your question, you know, about the fad, and we'll probably get into some later discussion around how this is becoming extremely political and polarizing, right? And I think what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing as we talk with members and, you know, just kind of going around and having these discussions, companies are kind of doing one of a few things, right? Because even though this has actually been around for a very long time, and it's back to like that importance of words, you know, what we called it maybe in the 80s or the 90s and what we're calling it in the 2000s, and we're always evolving it. And so it's really at the end of the day, how are we speaking and connecting this to the critical operations and outcomes of what we're trying to accomplish? That is not something that's just being seen as this separate standoff initiative or activity or function that we're doing because we now have to in response to political pressures or in response to some social injustice that's come up. And so while many companies and many entities began to lean in harder in this space, you know, as a result of 2020, some are now beginning to really reevaluate, you know, are we continuing down this path? Someone said to me, we've been doing this now for 5 years. Why are we still talking about it? 5 years? You're giving up so soon, right? So they're starting to really reevaluate. But then those who have really embedded this and are really genuine and true to this are also reevaluating in a way where they're understanding that they have to evolve it and that they have to start adapting even new strategies. And so we're seeing some companies retreat, right? We're all in this kind of financial space, and the economy has been extremely, trying to think of a word to use here. It's been wonky. And some of us are just kind of like at our basic Maslow theory right now, trying to keep doors open, trying to keep staff employed, trying to retain assets that we own or that we've invested in, but now are empty buildings. And then this thought of having to now start to, you know, continue to focus on DEI, which has been separate and not embedded in their overall strategy and authentic to what they were doing, they're failing to see that connection. And so I see that there are many who are now saying either they're trying to pivot or they're saying, you know what, we continue to need help to go harder, to go faster, to go forward.
I love that. I think what you said is real. You know, with the pressures that we're seeing, not only economic, you know, that the social pressure that we saw in the wake of the murder of George Floyd is not the same.
That's right.
And in addition, this has become politicized, right? And so our DEI work is being hit by some headwinds, political, you know, economic and social. And you're talking about maybe 2 tracks that organizations are taking. Either they're doubling down and maturing their work and recognizing that they need to stay on the path, or they're like, we're going to off ramp here. Talk to me about what it takes to sustain DEI in the face of that, in your role, right? And Ashley, if you're ready to take that, I'll start with you. Otherwise, Ayris, looks like you.
Listen, I say I'm a bucket person, and I always take work and break it up into buckets. And so as I look at this, I'm always thinking about a couple, and I like how you talked about your pillars, because we actually have 3 pillars that we focus on at NAREIT, and that's people, philanthropy, and partners being businesses. So that's just one thing. But when I think about kind of from an operational and an execution sustainability standpoint with DEI, I look at, and I talk with members and clients around systems, representation, transparency, systems, representation, and transparency. I think when you are transparent, and we have an advantage because our members, again, are publicly traded. So there's a lot of compliance, there's a lot of reporting. It forces your hand to share what you're doing in this space, right? What's your C-suite look like? What's your spend with diverse vendors? So that transparency makes you a little more accountable, right? It makes you have to continue with that path. And so it's working to create measures that allow you to be transparent, even in the spaces where you don't have to be.
Mhm.
And when you have representation that is reflective of the communities and the goals and the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, it brings a different lens in terms of decisions that you're making, right? How you're interpreting data, how you're collecting data, how you're making decisions around policies and procedures and practices, which comes back to those systems. And I really cringe when anything that is DEI, DEIB, DEIBA, whatever you want to use, is something that is just separate over here. Oh, we're going to have this supplier diversity initiative. Let's talk about how we go after diverse vendors, but we're not looking at our global procurement policies and practices and embedding it across the board, right? Or, oh, we want to now figure out how we get more women into the C-suite, but we're not looking at what our C-suite recruitment practices are across the board. And so I always go back to those like systems, representation, enforcing transparency.
So I'm going to add to that. So when we think about DEI work, I think sometimes, like you shared, it's its own entity, right? It's just these particular categories. I think when we start to embed this in the goals of our organization, I joke all the time. I've been kind of touring around all of our branches and kind of connecting folks to our DEI vision and lens. And I jokingly say, I'm the Office of DEI. I'm me in an office. And the truth of the matter is it can't be one person that drives the work. Yes, it's your leadership teams, but it's also the folks, whether it's your members of the community, your employees who are invested in what we're doing every day and allowing them to be invested and have these conversations and have these discussions. And it's not a place that it becomes a difficult or contentious conversation, but it is one that drives innovation. It's one that drives what we're talking about today, sustainability, right? So kind of, I couldn't agree more that it is right now we are in a unique position that the work that we do right now will truly impact the financial wellness, stability of our communities, but we have to keep going, right? 5 years. How long have we had inequity in this country? Much longer than 5 years, right? So we're not going to fix the problem in such a short period of time. There is much, much more work to do.
I just saw a quote today that said, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. It was in an article that is now put out about DEI in the commercial real estate industry. And I was like, oh, that just hit me.
Yeah. Miguel, I feel like you want to go. So another thing that I know we worked on, and I'm sure organizations have their DEI scorecards, but they should be global, right? They should not just be within your HR teams or just be, like you said, within procurement or supplier diversity. It should really be a global lens, and those metrics need to be talked about consistently with your teams. Right? Don't keep that information. Hey, we did a great job. No, what could we do better? We did great now with these particular metrics. What are we missing? What's intersectional, right? What's connecting multiple members of our communities or multiple levels of our employees, right? What does that look like? Miguel, I'll hand it to you.
Well, and actually to reflect a little bit on what you said, Ayris, when you talk about supply diversity, for example, one of the things that we did at the NCUA, actually, when I was doing supply diversity, was hardwire supply diversity to the actual process. So I needed to find a place in the procurement process where I could insert supply diversity, and it could be part and parcel of the process. So nobody could go through the process without actually stop getting $200 at the supply diversity desk. So that's one of the things that we focused on. And eventually from when we started to now, we moved from 6% of our spend with minority woman-owned businesses all the way up to 45. So that was actually a great shift. So that's the idea. The idea is to hardwire things into the process. To your point, actually, one of the things that I'm working on right now is DEI within the agency has been something that two groups talk about. either my office or the chairman. Everything in between, yeah, they support it, yes, they participate and all that. I'm not discounting those efforts, but people need to actually be having an active discussion within their own groups or departments around DEI. It might not have to look like DEI, but has to be a discussion about those type of things. To the question about whether some DEI is here to stay, I think it's here to stay, but not necessarily in the way that we have been talking about it. Part of the challenge has been that DEI took off with the murder of George Floyd, and it immediately became a race issue rather than a broader issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when people talk about, well, you know, I have this, you know, credit union in the middle of Nebraska, there's no people of color, so, you know, why are you beating me up? No, we're not beating you up. We're saying that you have to look at the people that you serve and see who's not being served. See whether people with disabilities or any other communities out there are not being looked at. So where do you start with that? You start with data, and we have to look at data to determine what are we doing and what is the impact of the things that we're doing. Yes, we have a process for supply diversity. Yes, we have a process for recruitment and outreach. But what are your outcomes? Are you really attracting, you know, Latinos? Are you attracting people with disabilities, veterans? And if you are, like NCUA, we have, you know, we surpassed the EEOC requirements on how many people with disability we should have. But then are we losing them faster than any other group? I don't know, but we have to look at the data, because you can be great at bringing them in, but terrible at retaining them. So data is going to tell you a big story. And ultimately, again, I have to kind of go back to the notion of culture, because everybody in this room has heard about culture eats strategy for breakfast. Everybody here has a strategic plan, but not many people look at the culture plan. And the culture plan is really what's going to drive your organization to have the outcomes that you want and have that sustainable. Now, DEI is part of the culture plan. If you don't do DEI, you might as well say that you don't care about culture, because you're not going to have an impact on that. So for me, my focus at the NCUA, and to make this sustainable, is let's talk about culture. Let's talk about data and the outcomes that you're committed to. If you see that a group is affected and that it's not being treated equitably, what are you going to do about it? And that has to be a business discussion and a business decision that, yes, I'm going to do something, or no, I'm not going to do something about it. But that has to be a conscious decision, not because it's a nice thing to do. It's because your numbers and your data and your outcomes are telling you the real story of what's happening.
A lot of pearls of wisdom that are being dropped here. I hope you all are picking them up. Really, really good stuff. I love this idea that, yeah, DEI is here to stay, but it's not going to look like what it looks like today. We need to continue to evolve it, to grow, and to be thoughtful and think about who it is we're not including, and how we do that in an effective way. I love that. And I'm going to throw you all a little bit of a curveball, because I've really kind of been thinking a little bit about a conversation I had with a credit union CEO, and also some of the conversations that we had earlier today, thinking about who typically is hardest hit in our communities when we have disasters, right? It is our low income, it is our marginalized folks, it is our communities of color. And so a lot of what we've been talking about right now has been looking at the internal piece of DEI, right? Internal to our organization. And of course, that has ripple effects out to our communities. But there's work being done within the movement, and I'm sure, in your industry as well, Ayris, really thinking consciously about how we can connect financial inclusion, financial equity, and see those communities that are being impacted by disasters. And so I'd love to hear from any of you about how this shows up in your organization, sort of the external piece, because there are two faces of this coin: the internal to the organization and the culture piece but also the piece that touches our communities and our members.
That is quite a curveball there. But I do value it because one of the things that we are consistently working with our members and talking with our members about is community and tenants, right? And it's interesting because we do cover commercial real estate. So often people think about housing, even though we're a lot more than housing. And the need to really challenge and push to understand, it's almost like oh, I hate to say it like this, but it's when you take care of your community and when we're being responsive to the needs of those who are often most marginalized, it's not necessarily the thing that rises to the top in this business space, right? And so we've talked about how there's been a lot of focus and intentionality around kind of the pipeline development and recruitment and retention of talent. Even now we're starting to expand into businesses, but that conversation and those strategies in this space, I would say, are still, as it relates to community and those most marginalized and our tenants who are occupying the spaces in which we own and operate assets, has not been the highest priority. And I think that there is a really great opportunity, particularly as we look at equity and inclusion, to lean in harder and further there. I have a community development background. And so when I actually first kind of came into this space and this role, I really thought I was going to be doing a lot more around that. And quite frankly, we are not even beginning to touch it or address it. So I value that you bring that up because, again, with us having members who are located all around the world, the way this work looks in California, Florida, France, India, I just came back from Kenya, I was in Tanzania, it's so different. And when you talk about being impacted, marginalized communities where infrastructure, which is also a type of REIT, is non-existent, you can just have one storm come through and wipe out a whole community, right? So, I mean, I think that I love that question, and I'm looking forward to seeing how others are addressing it, because we haven't even began to start tackling it from this kind of equitable and inclusion lens.
Thank you, Ayris.
So I just have a small thing to add, and I think it's it touches upon what you said about members. And I think when we're thinking about this work, we have to remember that or at least the work we've done internally, right? We talked about a lot about what we did internally for employees. Mm-hmm. Our employees are often our members, and they are also members of the community. Mm-hmm. These lenses are intersectional and interconnected. So what we're doing internally for our employees, the level of investment that we make in the well-being of our employees and the sense of belonging and the creating financial futures and freedom for our employees, we should have that level of intention and investment as we see the lens beyond our employees, right? When we talk about members of the community, there's some intersection there, right? So doing this work with intention, building your social impact strategy that is rooted in understanding the historical inequity. Historical inequity exists. You can't solve it in a short period of time, but consistently being intentional about how you are doing this work for your members and for the community, listening to them, exceptionally important. And it will help you build your strategy in a productive, sustainable way, I believe.
I think that goes back to, thinking about those communities and those tenants and those outside of your walls as having value, as being valuable to you, right? And I think something kind of like Miguel, this is not NAREIT, this is just Ayris kind of talking, right? I think sometimes we see people in certain communities as just tenant, they're just occupants, right? I mean, they're just a form of revenue. And so when we think about really caring about this work is really about people being at the center of what you're doing. And so when you're thinking beyond just your bottom line or the revenue or the number of members or the money that you're bringing in, and you're really thinking about the impact and the connectivity. And again, to your point, that we are all part of all of these communities that we're serving and that we're living in, that we're operating in, you start to think and move differently. And one of the things that we have been doing, though, is that we have been beginning to track and trace and see what are our member companies doing in their communities beyond just what they're doing within their companies. And we're finding ways to share that more and to amplify that more and to start to create best practices and toolkits, because it's, you don't want to just be a business. I mean, we have to be more than just a business. And we have to understand that connection to those who are most marginalized.
That's fantastic. I think one of the things about the work that we do, it is so incredibly challenging, is that it centers the humanity of everyone, right? And it's not something that necessarily aligns easily with the systems that we've created. So it is a struggle, and it's an uphill struggle. It's a Sisyphus, if you want, but we continue to push forward and push forward together. It also reminds me, right now we're reading a book at CUNA, Credit Union National Association. Every year we do a big read, and we're reading this book by Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us, what racism costs us and how we can prosper together. And the how we can prosper together is kind of what you were getting at. It is, I think it's so important to keep that in the forefront. Ultimately, by doing this work internal to the organization, yes, all the intersectionality, but also ensuring that we are, reaching out and serving our communities and our members equitably, and ensuring that they have access to financial services, and also, green lending, et cetera. We're actually going to be raising we'll be achieving this idea of prosperity together. And I guess we're getting close to the end of time. So I want to, I've got a couple of questions I'd love to ask you, but let me try this one. If there was one thing you could do, right, using your radical imagination, that would move the needle for marginalized communities, for communities of color, for low income, you decide. What would it be?
That's a hard one. So what I will say is investing in a culture that not only values differences, different lived experiences, but brings those lived experiences to the forefront of the work that we do each and every day. That the people who are, like you said before, might be the tenants that occupy spaces, that they are actually the people who could give us the most valuable information about how to change the lives of those who we see as similar to ourselves or different than ourselves. I know that was long, but the bottom line is valuing the folks that sometimes we do not even see in our day-to-day.
I'm trying to think, is this a magic wand moment or, okay. I think for me, everything starts with what's the motivation, right? We all have motivations for moving forward with different things and, having certain goals. But if I have my brothers, the most important, I think, powerful thing that you can have is information and real data, and then commitment, to do something about it. I mentioned that before because that's the direction that we're taking at NCUA. My focus is this is the data and this is what the data is showing you. So if I have my druthers, if we had only one thing to focus on, is a commitment on having equity across everybody and all the groups. And what does that look like? That looks like everybody has an opportunity to get the same outcomes. I'm not saying that you're entitled to the outcome. I'm saying that you have the opportunity to get the outcome. You have to go out there and get it. You have to work just as hard as anybody else. But the fact that, unfortunately, we can talk about, well, everything here is based on a meritocracy. But we know that it's not. It's not 100% a meritocracy. Some things are, some things are not. Sometimes it has to do with who you know. Sometimes it has to do with, who is from the same town that you are in or from the same school or whatever. So to me, if the focus of an organization is about ultimately focusing on equity, what are the outcomes that people with disabilities have, people from this other group have, and so forth. And I'm courageous enough to face it and courageous enough to commit to it, that to me will move the needle immensely. Because ultimately, if everybody can get to equitable outcomes, I'm not going to say that we're good, but we're going to be getting closer to good.
I think for me, it would be the removal of resistance. And that's in a few different, kind of verticals. If we're being honest, right? I mean, we're a capitalist society, and just the mere nature of how we're structured is, there's going to be some who are like, I'm up here and I need to protect this. And on one hand, I get that. Doesn't make it right, doesn't mean that it feels good. And so there's going to be resistance to beginning to open up for others to be able to rise up. And then sometimes you have people who have been oppressed for so long that there's resistance even within them in understanding the role that they play and the confidence that we need them to have and the perseverance we need them to have to continue to chip away. And so when we start talking about kind of shifting those paradigms, there's naturally going to be resistance, and there's always been resistance. And so I think for me, if we could just eliminate that, right? Where people are like, I'm not going to resist going as hard as I can to achieve all that I need to achieve to make sure I'm creating generational wealth and building sustainable futures and outcomes for those who come behind me. And we don't have resistance from those who have the resources, who have the power, who have the influence to say, you know what, there is enough for all of us, because there really is enough for all of us. That would be my big thing that I would just wave my magic wand around.
I love that. So we've got make those folks that are invisible visible. We hear their voices, equity, and remove the resistance. It's been pretty good, I would say. All right, so real quickly, we do have a couple of minutes left. FAD or here to stay? DEIB.
Here to stay.
Definitely here to stay.
Definitely here to stay.
All right, we've got 2 minutes. Can we open it up to maybe a question for the audience?
Aloha. Question for Ashley, but really for everyone. First of all, you guys are rock stars. Thank you. I've videoed most of that, and it will be on social media later. Millennial speaking. Okay, and speaking of the millennial thing and your why on this Gen Z aspect. So the millennial generation, the most diverse generation on the planet. We're talking diversity in ethnicity, languages, worldview, religions, sexual orientation, all of it, right? Raising Gen Z 1 billion times better and cooler at all those things than we are. So the fat are here to stay is an interesting question. Should we even be asking it when we already know who Gen Z is and they're about to inherit the whole thing?
So as a fellow, I guess I'm an elder millennial. I'm at the cusp. So as a fellow millennial, when the question was shared, I immediately talked to my wife and said, This is the question. I cannot wait to answer this, right? Because the truth is like I said earlier, these are conversations my 4th and 5th graders, these are conversations that are embedded in their everyday lived experiences, right? My 15-year-old is asking questions, about the lived experiences of those in her community and the lived experiences of those around the world, about what's currently going on in the world, right? These are conversations where there's opinions that have already been formulated about what inclusion looks like and what friendships look like and what long-term relationships and families look like. These young people already have a lens and an expectation of us, right? Millennials or older, that we know what they value and we speak to that. So yeah, it's still a question for us. It's not a question for them. Yeah.
That's the note I want to leave it on, because that's going to segue us directly to our next 2 segments, which are going to talk extensively about youth and youth energy in this movement. So can we have a round of applause for our panel?